Jim, would you direct our minds in that prayer?
Dear Heavenly Father, we come before you this hour to ask for your guidance through your word. As we look into the book of Leviticus, pray for Numbers. We pray that you would open our minds and our hearts to the things that you would have us to learn and understand and put in our life. We pray that you would be with Rex at this time, that he can recall the things he studied. Help us to glorify you in our lives and minds. We pray that you'd be with all of those who need a healing hand, those traveling. We pray that you would be with all the members of your family throughout the world, physically and spiritually. Pray that you would go with us, guide us, and direct us. We pray these things in your Son's name, Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior.
Amen. Okay, last week we started off and we looked at the first 7 chapters of Numbers, and I want to summarize what we talked about last week, some things that I think are important in the first 7 chapters. When we think of Numbers, we think of, obviously, numbers, but the reference here is not to a special number, it is numbering, okay, or taking a census, and there are 6 censuses taken by Moses and Aaron as they are stopped where? You remember where they were last week? Mount Sinai, okay. Guess what? They're the same place this week, but they won't be by the end of this class. We find that God, while they're at Mount Sinai there, selects the tribe of Levi as his priesthood. We may have thought it was done earlier, but it wasn't. It was done in chapter 3. Also in chapter 3, we find that God changed the law of the firstborn. What was God's law from Exodus of the firstborn? Every firstborn male belonged to whom? Belonged to God, okay? And what God changed it to was he took the tribe of Levi, and put them in the place of the firstborn from all the rest of the 11 tribes. And they were God's possession. They were his to do with as he saw fit. Then we find in chapter 5, God gives us the duties and the responsibility of the 3 Levitical families. Chapter 6, we find God's command for purity of the people, physical, spiritual, and then an interesting law, the law of jealousy, if you remember that. In chapter 6, something that from time to time comes up when we chat about it, is the chapter that talks about the Nazirite vow. And then in chapter 8, that we'll see, or excuse me, in chapter 7, just before we get to chapter 8, we have the dedication of the tabernacle and the offerings. And if you remember, it seemed strange to me at the time, but it makes sense as you continue to think about the Levitical priesthood. One of the things that was offered was not an animal, okay, it was what? Do you remember? Carts, okay? Why do those carts only go to the Gershonites and the Merarites? Yeah, they hauled everything that was composed of the temple, all of the wooden items, everything that was covered with gold. And then the Kohathites didn't get a cart because they had to do what? They had to carry everything on their shoulder because they had carrying the sacred items was their job. And so that takes us to chapter 8, which is really interesting because chapter 8 talks about the first setup of the temple, of the tabernacle. in chapter 8, verses 1 through 4. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and say to him, When you mount the lamps, the 7 lamps will give light in the front of the lampstand. Aaron therefore did so. He mounted its lamps at the front of the lampstand, just as the Lord had commanded Moses. Now this was the workmanship of the lampstand, and it goes on to talk about that. And we've already talked about that as we looked at Leviticus and Exodus. The building of all of the items. But what do you have to have in order to put the lampstand into use? What do you have to have already created? Fire. Well, you have to create fire, but I mean, you have to have some place to put it. And where did the lampstand go? It went in the temple, didn't it? It was. Yes, it eventually did, but at this point in time, it went into the tabernacle. And so we see the tabernacle being set up, the lampstand being set in it, okay? The next thing that we see in verses 6 through 22, we see the Levites are being cleansed physically and ceremonially. For what purpose? Who do they serve? They serve God and they serve Israel. It's a two-way street, okay? Both ways. In chapter 9, we see the observance of what for the first time? The Passover. We see observance of the Passover, okay? Thus the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the first month of the 2nd year after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Now let the sons of Israel observe the Passover at its appointed time. On the 14th day of this month at twilight you shall observe it. At its appointed time you shall observe it according to all the statutes and according to all its ordinances. So Moses told the sons of Israel to observe the Passover. And then in verse 5 it says, They observed the Passover in the first month on the 14th day of the month at twilight in the wilderness of Sinai, according to all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So the sons of Israel did. So we find Israel's relationship with God starts out how? The answer I'm looking for starts with the letter G. The second 2 letters are O's. And the last one is, they started out with a good relationship with God. Why? Because they were doing what he told them to do. God talked to Moses. Moses talked to Aaron. Both Moses and Aaron communicated with the people of Israel. And so things started out well. Going on in the 9th chapter, God's response to Moses, if accidental. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to the sons of Israel, saying, If any one of you or of your generations becomes unclean because of a dead person, or is on a distant journey, he may, however, observe the Passover to the Lord. Okay? In the 2nd month, on the 14th day at twilight, they shall observe it. How important was it to observe the Passover? If you didn't observe the Passover, what happened to you? You were what? You were cut off. Well, what does it mean to be cut off? In most cases, if you study the context, what was cut off, or essentially what was cut off, was your life. If you're cut off from the people, you're dead. You're killed. In this case, God's response to Moses, if they neglected the Passover, verse 13, but the man who is clean and is not on a journey and yet neglects to observe the Passover, that person shall then be cut off from his people, for he did not present the offering of the Lord at its appointed time, that man will bear his sin. It was important to God to observe the Passover, because it was recognition of God as what? As passing over them, as God protecting them. Okay? From whom? Where did they just leave? or they'd been gone for a year actually. They just left Egypt. And the Egyptians were burdening them and abusing them. And God says, I've heard you're complaining. I've heard you're talking about it. I've heard you want to leave Egypt. And so God says, okay, I'll send Moses, and Moses is going to take you out. And that's what we've been looking at through Exodus and Leviticus. And when we get into Numbers, we find they've been out of Egypt for how long now? Not quite 2 years. I gave you some specifics last. 14 months, roughly, they've been out of Egypt. And then when we get into chapter 9, verses 15 through 23, we find, we've talked about earlier, and 20 brought up the point when I made the comment earlier, I think when I was teaching one of the classes in Exodus, about wanderings in the wilderness and that term and how we use it. And I think we use it very loosely. And she was kind enough to point out to me that exactly the same terminology is used in Numbers. And what we see in Numbers, the 9th chapter, verses 15 through 23, which I'm going to read, is that we see the leadership of God. So yes, the people wandered around these wilderness areas and eventually got up to the plains of Moab. And what we find is they wandered around, but not in the sense that they didn't have leadership. So verse 15, now on the day that the tabernacle was erected, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and in the evening it was like the appearance of a fire over the tabernacle until morning. So it was continuously. The cloud would cover it by day and the appearance of fire by night. When did that start? Started here at Mount Sinai. Okay, as soon as they did what? Erected the tabernacle. As soon as they erected the tabernacle, God moved into the tabernacle in a physical sense, a phenomenon. Whenever the cloud was lifted from over the tent, afterward, this is verse 17, the sons of Israel would then set out, and in the place where the cloud settled down, there the sons of Israel would camp. At the command of the Lord, the sons of Israel would set out, and at the command of the Lord, they would camp. As long as the cloud settled over the tabernacle, they remained camped. Down to verse 23. At the command of the Lord, they camped. At the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept the Lord's charge according to the command of the Lord through Moses. So they had God directing them. And God directed them when they're supposed to camp, and God directed them when they're supposed to go. Chapter 10. God also gave Israel directions for an alert system, and I found this really interesting, and I got a little confused as I went through it the first time. There were 10 or 12 different events that could occur in or around the camp that required the use of the 2 trumpets that God told Moses and Aaron to create. I doubt that they were trumpets in what we normally think of as a trumpet today. I suspect they didn't have the valves that you normally, but they were that long trumpet that you see. Something like that anyway. The interesting part was, okay, in addition to their having these trumpets, apparently there was also an alarm mode and a non-alarm mode, depending on the circumstances. And if you read the entire section here, Numbers 10, 1 through 10, which I'm going to do briefly. The Lord spoke further to Moses, saying, make yourselves 2 trumpets of silver of hammered work. You shall make them, and you shall use them for summoning the congregation, for having the camp set out. When both are blown, all the congregation shall gather. When only one is blown, verse 4, then only the leaders come together. But when you blow an alarm, what was the difference between an alarm sound and a non-alarm sound? Does anybody here know?
One of 2 blasts.
I I have no idea. It really doesn't tell us. If you can find it in there, Oliver, please let me know. I couldn't find it. It's not revealed to us, but apparently there was an alarm sound, and when the alarm sounded, it signified one thing, and when a non-alarm sounded, it signified something else. If you look at verse 8, the priestly sons of Aaron were the only ones that were allowed to blow the silver trumpets, okay? And this shall be for you a perpetual statute throughout your generations. Verse 9, when you go to war in your land, what land is he talking about? The promised land, okay? The promised land. Against the adversary who attacks you, then you shall sound an alarm with the trumpets, that you may be remembered before the Lord and your God and be saved from your enemies. Also, which is interesting in verse 10, also in the day of your gladness, in your appointed feasts, and on the first days of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings. So there was the trumpets were used not only to, I guess, what I would think of as a negative sense, to gather all the warriors together, or to move them out, but for positive things also. Whenever you had a feast, whenever you had what today we might even think of as a get-together, you blew the trumpets so the people could gather around and be together. And then finally in verse 9, also in the day of your gladness, your appointed feast, and on the first days of your months, you shall blow the trumpets over your burnt offerings and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, and they shall be as a reminder of you before your God. I am the Lord your God. So it wasn't only to warn them that it's time to move, or to warn them that the enemy's coming. Do it when it's happy times too. In chapter 10, starting in verse 11 through the 12th chapter, we read about the journey from Sinai to Kadesh. Okay, you know where Sinai was, although they've decided Sinai, the mountain Sinai may have been in another place, in a different place than where I originally thought it was. I thought it was on the Sinai, at the south end of the Sinai Peninsula, but many scholars today believe that it was actually farther east, and it wasn't on the Sinai Peninsula at all, that it was over in the northern part of Arabia. And whether that's true or not, what we do find is that this is where they are, and they're about to move. In Numbers 10, verse 11, now in the second year, in the second month, on the 20th of the month, how long have they been here this time, since Numbers 1:1? They're moving on the 20th of the month. They've been there 20 days. That's what God tells us. And the sons of Israel set out on their journeys from the wilderness of Sinai. As we continue, we'll find out where they were heading. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. And the wilderness of Paran is one of those wildernesses. It is not distinctly identified on any map, but it apparently was northwest of Sinai. They moved out for the first time according to the commandment of the Lord through Moses. And so this is what we see happening in chapter 10, verse 11. And the way they departed, we know that God set up the camp and assigned where everyone would be in the camp. If you remember, the tabernacle itself was where? In the middle, right in the center of the camp. And what family surrounded the tabernacle? The Levites surrounded the tabernacle, okay? I know I have it in my notes right here. Well, I thought it was right here. There it is. The Gershonites, which was one of the Levitical families, the Gershonites were on the west side. The Kohathites were on the south side, and the Merarites were on the north side, and then Moses and Aaron and their immediate family were on the east side. And then around those were the remaining 12 tribes of Israel. So when they began to move, if we look in verse 14 of chapter 10, what we find is the standard of the camp of the sons of Judah, according to their armies, set out first. Okay, and the three armies that made up the camp of the sons of Judah were Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then we find, after they had already started apparently moving, then the tabernacle, in verse 17, then the tabernacle was taken down, and the sons of Gershon and Merari, who were carrying the tabernacle, set out. Next, the standard of the camp of Reuben, and the camp of Reuben had three families also. They had Reuben and Gad were the other two families that were part of the army or the camp of Reuben. And then we find in verse 21, after Reuben goes, then comes the Kohathites in verse 21, set out carrying the holy objects. The tabernacle, the reason they did that was in order the tabernacle was to be set up before their arrival. Interesting. Verse 5. The next standard of the camp was the camp of Ephraim, and the camp of Ephraim was made up of Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And then the standard of the camp of the sons of Dan was what I would normally think of it when you go camping. You always have somebody that's at the tail end. And no offense meant, Charlie, but that's somebody I always called when I was out camping and we were going somewhere. I always called it tail end Charlie. But so Dan and the other two tribes that were with Dan, Asher and Naphtali, made up the army that was at the end of the procession. And again, exactly how did the armies travel back then, or how did they arrange themselves? God doesn't tell us. I can't believe that they went single file. They had to go in some type of grouping of each one of the camps. And that way they were able to protect all of the holy objects. They were able to protect the Gershonites and the Merarites, who had the physical structure of the tabernacle that they were responsible for, and pulled their carts. In Numbers, the 10th chapter, verses 29 through 32, we run into an interesting individual. And his name is Hobab. And Hobab is the brother-in-law of Moses. And we only read of Hobab one other time in the scripture, and that's in the book of Judges. Verse 29, then Moses said to Hobab, the son of Reuel, the Midianite, Moses' father-in-law, we are setting out to the place of which the Lord said, I will give it to you. Come with us, and we will do you good, for the Lord has promised concerning Israel. But he said, no, I will not come, but rather I will go to my own land and relatives. And then again, Moses says, then he said to him, please do not leave us, inasmuch as you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will be as eyes for us. So it will be, if you go with us, that whatever good the Lord does for us, we will do for you. So Moses asked Hobab, H-O-B-A-B, to become their guide, because he's aware of the physical environment they find themselves in, and probably particularly for what element was he was Moses most interested in? Water, okay? I don't think the climate in that particular area, which is a desert, has significantly changed in the last 4,000 years. And so I think that's the issue that's being under consideration here. Hobab knew where the wells were, where the water was, okay? Now, did Hobab leave or did he stay with them? God doesn't tell us. And we don't, again, run into Hobab again until we get into Judges, and I'm not convinced that it's the same Hobab, but it may be. They were both related to Moses, his in-laws. So then we find in verse 33 of the 10th chapter, Israel travels for 3 days toward Paran, that is the wilderness of Paran, which was northwest of Sinai. Okay? Now, did they travel 3 days straight through? Was there a break in there somewhere? It doesn't tell us. Perhaps they traveled 3 days straight through. It doesn't talk about them resetting up the temple, and the reason they had to reset up the temple because they had a process of worship in the tabernacle, not the temple, I'm sorry, in the tabernacle that they had to go through, and they had to burn incense how often? Continually, okay? They were to keep the lights going how often? Today we'd call it 24/7. That was a requirement. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day, and when they set out from the camp, and the cloud of fire was over them. We find in the 35th verse of chapter 10 that Moses prays for God's protection. Then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, "Rise up, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it comes to rest, he said, "Lord, return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel." So God prayed when they set out. God prayed when they stopped. Excuse me, Moses prayed when they set out for God's guidance, and he also prayed when they stopped. Again, you know, the thing that it reminds me of is, do I pray enough? Do I pray as much as I should? And when I think about it, the answer I come up with is no. I don't know if any of us do. In chapter 11, we find what is the beginning of the complaints and or whining. In Numbers, the 11th chapter, verses 1 through 3, the people complain, and an angry Jehovah chastises them. Now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord. And when the Lord heard it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned around them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. The people therefore cried out to Moses, and Moses prayed to the Lord, and the fire died out. So the name of that place was called Taberah, because the fire of the Lord burned among them. Doesn't indicate that anybody was significantly damaged or killed, but God got their attention. And then we find out as we look at verses 6 through 9 that the complaint was about their lack of meat, and their complaint was about what God was giving them, okay? And their recollection was not about how God was taking care of them or the miracles that he had performed, but their recollection is about the food that they had in what country? Egypt, okay? Starting in verse 6, there is nothing at all to look at except this manna. Doesn't sound like a very positive statement to me. Now the manna was like coriander seed, and he goes on to talk about that, on how they prepared it. And then in verses 10 through 15, we find our friend, the leader of the people, complains to God also. Now Moses heard the people weeping throughout their families, each man at the doorway of his tent, and the anger of the Lord was kindled greatly, and Moses was displeased. So Moses said to the Lord, "Why have you been so hard on your servant?" What servant is Moses talking about? He's talking about himself. Yeah, he's talking about me. Okay, why have you been so hard on me, God? Okay? And why have I not found favor in your sight that you have laid the burden of all this people on me? Oh, Lord, you've given me all of these people to lead, and it's such a burden. Well, it was a burden, okay? Was it I who conceived all this people? Wow. You want to throw that in God's face? Was it I who brought them forth, that you should say to me, carry them in your bosom as a nurse carries a nursing infant to the land which you swore to their fathers? Where am I to get meat to give to all this people? For they weep before me, saying, give us meat that we may eat. I alone am not able to carry all this people, because it's too burdensome for me. Was in fact Moses carrying the people at all? Who was carrying the people? God was carrying the people, okay? God pushed back the water on the Red Sea. It wasn't Moses. I mean, he may have held out there the staff as God directed him to, but that's all he did. He didn't make the water part so they could cross on dry land. And all these miracles that had happened, you know, it reminds me of all the things that who did in a later time. And all the response that he got from his fellow Jews was, show us a what? Show us a sign, okay? There's some interesting comparisons when you think of Moses and what he did, and Jesus and what he did. Interesting character. So Moses is concerned about, where am I going to get meat? Okay, well, what was his recommendation? Chapter 11, verses 16 through 18. The Lord therefore said to Moses, gather for me 70 men from the elders of Israel, whom you know to be elders of the people and their officers, and bring them to the tent of meeting, and let them take their stand there with you. So God determined we're going to have 70 members. Now this may have been a nascent Sanhedrin that we see later, but that's where the 70 numbers for the Sanhedrin came from, I'm sure. Then I will come down and speak with you there, and I will take the Spirit who is upon you. What Spirit was upon Moses? The Holy Spirit was upon Moses, okay? That's the Spirit he's talking about. Who is upon you, and I will put him upon them, and they shall bear the burden of the people with you, so that you will not bear it all alone. So God took a piece of the Holy Spirit and gave it to these 70, from Moses, and gave it to these 70 men, right? I say that facetiously because I know some people that believe that literally we all have a piece of the Holy Spirit, and they think of it almost in a physical sense. But what we find here is, what's God giving them? The ability to do what? I'm sorry?
They were able to prophesy.
Yes, well, one of the things they did was to prophesy, okay? One of the things that they did was to be able to give direction to the people of Israel so that they could assist Moses in directing the people. And then we find in verses 18 through 24 of chapter 11, God gives Israel its answer about the complaint about meat. Say to the people, and I love this passage starting in the next verse, but say to the people, starting in verse 18, consecrate yourselves for tomorrow, and you shall eat meat, for you have wept in the ears of the Lord, saying, oh, that someone would give us meat to eat, for we were well off in Egypt. Well, they have a real short memory, don't they? I'm glad that doesn't happen to any of us today, right? That we don't have a short memory about how God has blessed us. Therefore, the Lord will give you meat, and you shall eat. You shall eat not 1 day, nor 2 days, nor 5 days, nor 10 days, nor 20 days, but a whole month, until it comes out of your nostrils, becomes loathsome to you, because you have rejected the Lord who is among you, and have wept before him, saying, why did we ever leave Egypt? That sounds so funny. I can't think of having that much food, but I mean, that's what they complained about. And then we see that Moses' his faith falters a little bit. He questions God's ability to deliver the meat. Starting in verse 21, Moses said, the people among whom I am are 600,000 on foot, and that's just the males, the fighting males. 603,550 to be exact. Yet you have said, I will give them meat so that they may eat for a whole month. Should flocks and herds be slaughtered for them to be sufficient for them? Or should all the fish of the sea be gathered together for them to be sufficient for them? And the Lord said to Moses, is the Lord's power limited? Now you shall see whether my word will come true for you or not. So Moses went out and told the people the words of the Lord. And what are we going to find? That God fed them, that God gave them the meat they wanted. In chapter 12, Moses has opposition from his family. His brother, Aaron, and Miriam, his sister. Starting in verse 12 of chapter 12. Then Miriam and Aaron spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman who he had married. And they said, has the Lord indeed spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? And the Lord heard it. Verse 4, suddenly the Lord said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, you three come out to the tent of meeting. So the three of them came out. Then the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud and stood at the doorway of the tent. And he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they both came forward, he said, hear now my words. If there is a prophet among you, I, the Lord, shall make myself known to him in a vision. I shall speak with him in a dream. Not so with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, even openly, and not in dark sayings. And he beholds the form of the Lord. Then why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? So we find then in verses 9 through 15 that the anger of the Lord burned against them, specifically against Miriam and Aaron, and Miriam became leprous in verse 10. And then Aaron speaks to Moses, O my Lord, I beg you, do not account this sin to us, in which we have acted foolishly, in which we have sinned. Now he admits that he sinned and said, don't hold me accountable for it. It's too soon, Kevin. Okay.
Sorry.
That's all right.
I do have a comment.
I'm just teasing. You do have a comment? Oh, go ahead then, please.
So just earlier, Moses is complaining that God's not really, hey, I'm carrying this stuff, and you're not watching over me, and yada,
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's the same with us today. God's going to take care of us. If we're out teaching the truth, guess what? God's going to protect us. Okay? Does that mean that some wacko may not pull out a gun and shoot you? No. But I tell you what, you got a better prize waiting for you. But the bottom line is God is going to spread His word the most effective way He can. And I think that's what we see here. God's telling Aaron and Miriam, hey, Moses is the one that I speak directly with. He's the one to whom I give the visions. Any thoughts or other comments up through chapter 11?
Yeah.
Go ahead, sir.
What did they do for food?
What did they do for food?
Up to this point?
Up to this point?
I assumed that they were, they were already being provided by God with the quail and stuff before they left Mount Sinai.
Not true.
I know. Yeah.
How is it provided? I don't know. The only one that can tell you has not given you revelation that tells you what you want to know.
I didn't know.
You know,
They had manna.
what? Well, they had manna, okay, and that's what they were complaining about. The only thing we got to eat is this manna. That was one of their complaints. What they wanted was meat. Why did they want meat? When they talk about how wonderful it was in Egypt, one of the things that always sticks in my mind is that one of the things that they talk about is leeks, okay, which is, those of you that know, it's of the onion family, I guess, or maybe the other way around. Anyway, it's a vegetable. God took care of them. How? I don't know. God doesn't tell me. Any other thoughts or comments? Okay, next week we will start on chapter 13, and hopefully we'll move along a little more speedily. I would like to get at least 7 or 8 chapters done a week, so it doesn't take until the middle of the summer to get through Numbers.
Some of us are slower. We like going slow.
Well, trust me, we are going slow. I mean, I'm going slow, because I wanted to get more done. But while we will start next week with chapter 13, we will see Israel moving into the wilderness of Paran. What happens? What's the big deal that happens in the wilderness of Paran that we'll see in next week's class? It's at a town. I don't want to say city, because I don't think it was a city. I think it was a little bit smaller than that. But what happens in Paran at Kadesh? What does Israel do? What does God tell Moses to do? Send out
Spies. Check out there.
Yeah. Send out spies. Okay, send out 12 spies. Okay, 10 of them come back with a bad report, 2 come back with the truth. And at this point, we will end the class. Thank you for your time and attention.